For the Nazis, death was not enough. It was not enough to kill their enemies. They had to humiliate them, degrade them, and strip them of all dignity before their last breath. Some prisoners were boiled alive, their skin peeling off in shreds while they still screamed. Others were tied to posts and devoured by trained dogs. Some froze to death, their limbs shattering like glass. In the concentration camps, executioners perfected every atrocity, from mass executions with lethal injections to inhumane medical experiments. And when bullets were not an option, they experimented with even more sadistic methods, forms of murder so horrific that even the Nazis themselves were horrified. But among all the atrocities, there was one that surpassed the rest. A method of execution so slow, so atrocious, that not even the fanatics of the Third Reich could bear to watch it to the end. What was the worst method of execution in World War II? Who devised it? And how far did the Nazis go in their obsession with perfecting death? The industry of extermination, how the Third Reich turned death into a precision machine. By the late 1930s, while the world had yet to fathom the magnitude of the barbarity about to unfold, death was already being designed with German precision in the offices of the Third Reich. This was not about chaotic murders or improvised massacres. The Nazi regime understood that the systematic elimination of entire populations had to be an efficient, rational, and meticulously planned process. Like a factory optimizing its production line, the architects of genocide perfected every link in the chain of slaughter. The obsession with efficiency would not only define the nature of the Holocaust, but also elevate it to a scale never before seen in human history. On January 20th, 1942, in a luxurious villa on the shores of Lake Wannsee, a meeting took place that would determine the fate of millions. This was no improvised gathering or mere administrative meeting. There were no shouting matches or fiery speeches, no uniformed soldiers or visible weapons, only men in suits, bureaucrats with academic backgrounds, high-ranking Reich officials and SS members. 15 men sat around a table with the purpose of formalizing the extermination of the entire Jewish population of Europe. Hitler's order already existed. The question under discussion was not whether they should die, but how to do it as quickly, cheaply, and efficiently as possible. Reinhard Heydrich presided over the meeting with the confidence of someone who knew he had absolute control. Possessing an inhuman coldness, he outlined the plan with his characteristic bureaucratic precision. Beside him, Adolf Eichmann took notes on every decision in the official minutes, a document that decades later would be key in reconstructing the details of that morning. Also present at the table were figures such as Wilhelm Stuckart, architect of the Nuremberg laws, Erich Neumann, responsible for integrating the Reich's economy into the extermination process, Friedrich Kritzinger, a key figure in Hitler's government, and Karl Eberhard Schöngarth, a Gestapo officer experienced in mass killings on the Eastern Front. Each had a role in the machinery of death. The tone of the discussion was strictly technical. Jewish population figures were reviewed for every European country, from occupied territories to those yet to be conquered. Transport routes were calculated, train capacities assessed, the profitability of slave labor before execution analyzed, and the best ways to dispose of the bodies examined. There were no moral dilemmas, no hesitation. Human beings were debated as if they were mere commodities. At one point, Erich Neumann suggested that economically valuable Jews should be used for forced labor before being eliminated. The idea fit perfectly within the mindset of the Third Reich. If a victim could still produce, they would be exploited until they were no longer useful. Only then would they be murdered. For the Nazis, extermination had to make use of every available resource, every ounce of labor before reducing a prisoner to nothing. The efficiency of murder itself was also a subject of analysis. Up to that point, the Nazis had primarily relied on mass shootings, particularly on the Eastern Front, where Einsatzgruppen exterminated entire communities. However, this method had flaws. Executions were too slow, consumed large amounts of ammunition, and, most concerning for the Nazis, had a psychological toll on the executioners themselves. Himmler, having witnessed an execution in Minsk, was visibly disturbed after seeing children and women killed at point-blank range. A more clean, industrial, and detached method was needed. Gas vans had been tested with some success in Chelmno, but they were not entirely efficient. Poisoning took too long, and bodies piled up chaotically, complicating their disposal. Auschwitz had already begun experimenting with Zyklon B on Soviet prisoners, and the results were promising. The goal was not just to kill, but to do so with maximum optimization. However, the extermination was not solely the work of the Nazi state apparatus. Major German corporations actively participated, not just by supplying materials, but by designing technology to optimize mass murder. IG Farben, the powerful chemical conglomerate, was among the most deeply involved in the machinery of death. Besides manufacturing the lethal Zyklon B used in the gas chambers, it also exploited slave labor in its factories, even building an industrial complex next to Auschwitz to ensure a constant supply of workforce. Thousands of prisoners died under inhumane conditions, producing synthetic rubber and fuel. Siemens, a symbol of German engineering, also profited from the Holocaust. Its factories used concentration camp prisoners, subjecting them to grueling work shifts in the production of electrical equipment while designing telecommunications systems for SS facilities. The company even planned the construction of electronically controlled gas chambers, though this project was never realized. Topf and Söhne, a construction firm, played a crucial role in the efficiency of genocide. They designed the crematory ovens that operated in Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and other extermination camps. Their engineers worked closely with the SS to develop ovens capable of incinerating bodies at an accelerated rate, maximizing corpse disposal efficiency. In Auschwitz, their technology allowed for the cremation of up to 4,756 bodies per day. Other companies, such as Krupp and Daimler-Benz, benefited from slave labor, using prisoners of war and deportees in their factories. The logic was always the same. Each slave worker meant a reduction in production costs, and when their body could no longer endure, they were simply replaced with another. The contracts between the Nazi government and these corporations were highly lucrative. The companies did not merely accept participation in the Holocaust, they competed with each other for contracts with the Reich. In some cases, the very engineers who designed the extermination infrastructure visited the camps to make adjustments and improve the productivity of the killing process. When the war ended, most of these companies continued operating as usual. Some executives were tried at Nuremberg, such as the directors of IG Farben, who received light sentences despite their involvement in war crimes. The company was dissolved, but its former subsidiaries, such as Bayer and BASF, survived and thrived in the post-war era. Other businessmen, like those of Topf and Sons, never faced justice. The Wannsee Conference was not the origin of the Holocaust, but it was its turning point. What had until then been scattered massacres, shootings, and disorganized deportations became an industrial machine designed to kill with maximum efficiency. And in that machine, German industry played a crucial role. Private companies helped turn genocide into a precise, profitable, and meticulously calculated operation. The attendees left the villa at Wannsee without a trace of guilt. They had not killed anyone with their own hands. They had not fired a single shot. They had merely designed the process that others would carry out. Before leaving, they toasted with cognac. The Holocaust had just become a machine of precision, the most sadistic and experimental executions of the Third Reich. The atrocities committed by the Third Reich during World War II were not limited to the systematic persecution and extermination of millions of people. They also included a series of executions marked by a cruelty and sadism that defy all human logic. Death was not merely an act of war or a consequence of the brutality of concentration camps. In many cases, it became a form of entertainment, a demonstration of absolute power where torture and suffering were inflicted with chilling meticulousness. Killing was not enough. It had to be turned into a spectacle, a show of dominance over the victim, a process that stripped the person of all dignity before taking their life. Among the most horrifying episodes of this perverse logic were the massacres carried out by special units of the SS and the Gestapo, which often acted with a level of brutality that was considered excessive even within the Nazi regime. One such example is the Dirlewanger Brigade, commanded by Oskar Dirlewanger, a man whose sadism was infamous even among the Nazis. His unit, composed of violent criminals released from prison, was tasked with crushing resistance on the Eastern Front and during the Warsaw Uprising. However, their methods went far beyond mere military operations. In Belarus, the Dirlewanger Brigade locked hundreds of women and children inside barns, doused the buildings with gasoline and set them on fire. As the flames consumed their victims, the soldiers fired at those who tried to escape, turning the massacre into a sadistic game. In Warsaw, members of the unit raped women before executing them, killed children by smashing them against walls, and mutilated prisoners purely for pleasure. The brutality of this unit was so extreme that even officers of the Wehrmacht, accustomed to the violence of war, complained about their behavior. Nevertheless, Dirlewanger continued to enjoy the support of the SS until the collapse of the Third Reich. But barbarity did not always stem from openly sadistic figures. In some cases, those responsible for mass executions were ordinary men, bureaucrats with no prior history of violence, who simply followed orders. One of the most chilling cases is that of Police Battalion 101, a reserve unit composed of middle-aged men with no significant military experience. In July 1942, this unit received orders to exterminate the entire Jewish population of the Polish village of Józefów. Their commander, Wilhelm Trapp, was not a fanatic. It is said that he even wept as he relayed the order to his men. He told them that if anyone did not want to participate in the execution, they could step aside. But most did not. For hours, these policemen shot hundreds of men, women, and children in the nearby forest. They forced them to kneel before mass graves and shot them in the back of the head. Those who initially refused to take part in the killings eventually gave in to group pressure and began executing prisoners. By the end of the day, nearly all of them had killed with their own hands. They were not sadists or experienced war criminals. They were ordinary men who, in a context of obedience and social pressure, became executioners. In concentration camps, mass murder was not always an efficient process. In some cases, SS guards improvised execution methods designed to cause maximum suffering. In Mauthausen, a particularly cruel practice became a macabre routine: the paratrooper jump. Prisoners were taken to the camp's quarry and forced to throw themselves off a 40-meter cliff. If they refused, they were pushed without hesitation. Sometimes the guards turned the spectacle into a game, forcing prisoners to sing Nazi anthems before jumping or pushing them in groups to see who would survive the longest. If a prisoner did not die upon impact, the guards would descend and finish them off by beating them to death. In other camps, even more horrifying methods were used. In Sachsenhausen, an SS officer named Kurt Icarius trained dogs to tear prisoners apart while still alive. Sometimes the guards would release the animals into a group of prisoners and place bets on who would be the first to fall. The dogs were trained to attack the face and neck, ensuring a slow and agonizing death. In extermination camps, where death became a methodical routine, some commanders and guards found ways to turn murder into an act of pure sadism. Brutality was not limited to gas chambers or mass shootings. In many cases, executioners decided to experiment with the limits of human endurance to extreme suffering, improvising execution methods that seemed designed not just to kill, but to prolong the agony of the victims. In Sobibor and Treblinka, some prisoners were thrown alive into mass graves filled with decomposing bodies and forced to remain there until their turn for execution arrived. Survivors have testified that the most unfortunate among them, trapped between rotting corpses, tried to stay upright, enduring the unbearable stench and the sight of worms devouring the bodies around them. For some, death came before the gunshot, victims of suffocation, despair, or uncontrollable panic attacks. At times, the strongest prisoners were forced to trample the bodies of their own companions to make room in the graves, a final act of degradation before their own execution. In other cases, particularly cruel methods of torture were used before execution. The macabre creativity of the executioners knew no limits. At Stutthof, prisoners began to be killed with gasoline injections directly into the heart. Death was not instant. The victims convulsed, suffered agonizing spasms, and died after several minutes of extreme suffering, while the guards watched with an almost scientific curiosity, taking notes on how long each individual took to succumb. In some experiments, the Nazis altered the amount of gasoline injected to see if smaller doses prolonged the agony. The prisoners' skin turned a purplish hue as the poison coursed through their veins, causing unbearable pain from within. When resource shortages made administering the poison difficult, substitutes like carbolic acid were used, a highly toxic substance that burned internal organs before causing death. The injection was administered directly into the heart or the jugular vein, and the executioners amused themselves by watching how the victims desperately clung to their last moments of life, their muscles twisting in uncontrollable spasms. But cruelty was not limited to chemical methods. In some camps, the Nazis turned death into a kind of macabre game. There are reports of prisoners being forced to fight each other to the death, with the promise that the winner would receive a quick execution, while the loser would suffer prolonged torture. In other cases, random executions were carried out to instill terror. Guards would order a group of prisoners to dig a pit and, without warning, shoot them one by one as the others watched, not knowing when their turn would come. At Treblinka, there are documented cases where prisoners were forced to kneel in a row, while an SS officer shot each one in the back of the head with meticulous precision. Their bodies fell in sequence, forming piles of corpses that the surviving prisoners had to stack before the next group of victims took their place. The monotony of death became routine for the executioners, who killed hundreds of people a day without showing the slightest emotion. Winter also became a weapon for the Nazis. In some camps, prisoners were forced to remain naked in sub-zero temperatures until their bodies slowly froze. At Auschwitz, witnesses described how guards sprayed prisoners with water during snowstorms to accelerate the freezing process, turning their bodies into ice statues that remained standing until they finally collapsed. For some executioners, torture did not end with death. In more than one case, the victims' corpses were mutilated or used to train new SS recruits, who practiced bayonet strikes or point-blank shots on the lifeless bodies before throwing them into mass graves. During the final days of the Third Reich, when defeat was imminent and desperation took hold of the Nazi ranks, executions became even more chaotic and brutal. The disciplined and meticulous structure of systematic extermination collapsed, giving way to an uncontrolled spiral of violence. Executions were no longer solely dictated by the logic of the final solution, but became a tool of retaliation, panic, and irrational destruction. SS officers, Gestapo members, and concentration camp commanders began killing indiscriminately, whether to cover up evidence, eliminate witnesses, or simply vent their frustration over the collapse of the regime. In Berlin, in the weeks leading up to the city's fall, the Gestapo turned metro stations into slaughterhouses. As the Red Army advanced and panic spread among the population, anyone suspected of desertion, defeatism, or treason was executed on the spot. Thousands of civilians, German soldiers, and political prisoners were murdered in tunnels and underground corridors, many without even knowing the exact reason for their execution. In some cases, the killings were carried out so haphazardly that bodies piled up to the ceiling, blocking access and forcing executioners to move the massacres to other parts of the city. There was no time for trials or interrogations. The executioners operated under direct orders from the remaining Nazi leaders in Berlin, who, hidden in the Chancellery bunker, issued extermination orders amid the Reich's final descent into madness. Paranoia reached such extremes that even members of the Nazi Party itself began to be executed on suspicion of disloyalty. In the final days of April 1945, SS soldiers stormed Lehrterstrasse prison and killed more than 500 political prisoners, fearing they might be freed by the Soviets. Many of these prisoners were former Wehrmacht officers accused of participating in the failed July 1944 assassination attempt against Hitler. The purge also extended to civilians accused of listening to foreign radio broadcasts or of not showing enough enthusiasm for the city's defense. Nazi desperation was reflected in the brutality of these executions. In some cases, victims were hanged from lampposts with signs reading "traitor" or "coward" as a warning to others. Meanwhile, in the concentration camps that were still operational, the Nazis tried to erase evidence of their crimes by killing the remaining prisoners in the fastest and most brutal ways possible. At Dachau, prisoners were executed en masse as Allied forces approached. In an attempt to speed up the process, some guards had victims line up in large groups before opening fire with machine guns, leaving hundreds of bodies piled up in courtyards and barracks. In other camps, crematoriums were pushed to their limits, with executioners throwing bodies, some still showing signs of life, into the fire to avoid wasting time on conventional executions. At Mauthausen, some prisoners were forced into gas chambers without even closing the doors properly, causing the gas to leak outside and making the executioners themselves feel the effects of intoxication. At Ravensbrück, a predominantly female concentration camp, the last executions were carried out in such desperate haste that some victims were thrown alive into mass graves before receiving the coup de grâce. Surviving witnesses recounted how, in the final days, the guards no longer bothered to ensure that the victims were dead before covering their bodies with dirt. Chaos and improvisation replaced the meticulousness with which the Holocaust had been conducted up to that point. In other camps, such as Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald, the Nazis ordered the destruction of documents and records before beginning the final massacres. The Sonderkommando, the prisoner units forced to handle corpses in the extermination camps, were almost entirely eliminated to prevent them from testifying about what they had seen. As the collapse of the Third Reich became inevitable, some SS units attempted to flee, leaving behind scenes of absolute horror. In some cases, prisoners were abandoned in sealed barracks without food or water, left to die of starvation before the Allies arrived. At Bergen-Belsen, the situation became so desperate that when the British liberated the camp, they found thousands of corpses scattered on the ground and survivors in such deplorable conditions that many died even after being rescued. The desperation of the Nazis not only led to the final extermination of thousands of victims, but also revealed the utter indifference to human life that had characterized the entire regime. The last act of cruelty of the Third Reich did not take place in the camps or metro stations, but on the roads and forests of Germany and Poland. In the so-called death marches, tens of thousands of prisoners were forced to walk hundreds of kilometers under extreme temperatures without food or rest, with the sole purpose of preventing them from falling into Allied hands. Those who could not keep pace were executed along the way, their bodies left in roadside ditches. Some survivors recounted how Nazi guards took pleasure in shooting prisoners who collapsed, while others were torn apart alive by dogs trained to attack those who tried to escape. The death marches were the cruelest epilogue to a genocide that, until its very last moment, was defined by sadism, brutality, and an absolute lack of humanity. The most brutal method, asphyxiation by tank exhaust gas. The Holocaust was not only a machine of extermination, but also a constant process of experimentation to optimize death. Before the gas chambers of Auschwitz and Treblinka established a definitive model, the Nazis tested more rudimentary methods, some of which turned out to be even more terrifying. Among them, execution using sealed gas trucks stood out as one of the most brutal forms of mass murder, a method where death came slowly among muffled screams in the darkness of an airtight compartment. The principle behind this system was as simple as it was ruthless. These were trucks with sealed compartments in which engine exhaust gases were redirected inside, suffocating the victims with a lethal mixture of carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. Unlike fixed gas chambers, where death was relatively quick, prisoners inside the gas wagon could take up to 30 minutes to die. Everything depended on the outside temperature and the engine's performance. In winter, when the cold slowed combustion, the agony lasted even longer. The Chelmno extermination camp was the first to adopt this method on a large scale. Here, thousands of Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, and political dissidents were killed inside these vehicles. But it was not the only place where they were used. On the Eastern Front, the Einsatzgruppen implemented them to exterminate entire communities without the need for shootings. The main advantage, from the Nazi perspective, was the automation of murder. Executioners only had to close the doors and start the engine. There were no gunshots, no physical contact with the victims. Death became more distant, more mechanical, more industrial. But the brutality of the gas trucks was not only in their execution mechanism, but also in the conditions in which it occurred. Inside the compartment, the lack of oxygen triggered panic within minutes. Survivors of the first phase of gassing described how the bodies ended up piled chaotically, with the marks of desperation etched onto their faces. The strongest climbed over the weakest in an instinctive attempt to reach air. Some trucks arrived at their destination with people still agonizing inside. The executioners, accustomed to the procedure, would open the doors and let the bodies fall as if they were inert cargo. The development of this extermination system did not originate in concentration camps, but in German psychiatric hospitals. Before the final solution, the Nazi regime implemented the Action T4 program, designed to eliminate people with physical and mental disabilities. In these centers, Nazi doctors tested various methods of murder, from lethal injections to makeshift gas chambers. It was in these experiments that the idea of using engine exhaust gases to cause death by asphyxiation was perfected. Walter Rauff, a high-ranking SS officer, was one of the main architects of this system. He designed and oversaw the implementation of gas trucks on the Eastern Front. Rauff understood that executions needed to be efficient, but also psychologically tolerable for the executioners. Reports captured by the Allies after the war reveal that the drivers of these trucks complained not about the act of killing, but about the logistical difficulties they faced. The stench was unbearable. Bodily fluids seeped through the compartment floor and became embedded in the vehicle's structure. To solve this problem, the Nazis installed grates on the truck floors, allowing blood and other waste to drain before cleaning. Not all bodies were examined before being discarded. Some were thrown into mass graves while still showing signs of life. In certain documented cases, prisoners who did not die in the truck were buried alive, covered with dirt among the corpses. Although brutal, this method of execution had technical disadvantages. The engine had to remain running for long periods, causing frequent breakdowns. Additionally, the number of victims that could be killed in each use was lower compared to the fixed gas chambers of Auschwitz and Treblinka. For these reasons, the Nazis gradually abandoned it in favor of more efficient methods. Walter Rauff, the man who perfected the gas trucks, never faced justice. After the war, he escaped to South America and lived in Chile until his death in 1984. Despite multiple extradition requests, he was never tried for his crimes. His legacy, however, extended beyond the Holocaust. Declassified documents indicate that his knowledge of execution methods was consulted by dictatorial regimes in Latin America decades later. The use of gas trucks represents an intermediate phase in the evolution of the Nazi extermination machinery. It was not the fastest or the most efficient method, but it was one of the most terrifying. Every death inside those sealed compartments occurred in darkness, among screams that no one heard, inside a vehicle that continued moving as if it were merely transporting cargo. Surgeons of extermination, the Nazi doctors and their lethal experiments. Death in the Third Reich was not merely a bureaucratic process or an act of sadism driven by fanaticism. For some, execution became an experiment. In the laboratories and operating rooms of concentration camps, SS doctors took brutality to a level that defied all logic. They did not simply kill, but meticulously documented suffering, dissected agony, and transformed torture into a subject of study. In their distorted vision of science, murder had to be analyzed, quantified, and optimized. The most macabre aspect of these experiments was not just the lack of ethics or the absolute disregard for human life, but the fact that many of these doctors considered themselves legitimate scientists, convinced that their studies could contribute to the progress of medicine and biology. Their cruelty was not only in the violence of their actions, but in the coldness with which they turned suffering into clinical data. One of the main architects of this depravity was Sigmund Rasche, a Luftwaffe doctor obsessed with human resistance to extreme conditions. At Dachau, Rasche used prisoners as test subjects in extreme altitude simulations. He placed them in low-pressure chambers and gradually reduced the oxygen levels to simulate altitudes exceeding 15,000 meters. The results were horrifying. Convulsions, internal hemorrhages, brains destroyed by decompression. Some victims were dissected while still alive to examine the effects of pulmonary collapse in real time. As his experiments progressed, Rasche began testing how rapid descents affected the body, simulating what would happen if a pilot were ejected from an aircraft without a pressurized suit. Prisoners writhed in pain as gas accumulated in their blood, causing lethal embolisms. In the reports he sent to the Luftwaffe, Rasche described these episodes with the detachment of a researcher analyzing the behavior of a laboratory animal. But Rasche's experimentation was not limited to altitude. He also conducted studies on extreme hypothermia to determine how long a German soldier could survive in freezing waters before dying. Naked prisoners were submerged in tanks of icy water, sometimes for hours, while Nazi doctors recorded the speed at which the human body collapsed. The victims' skin turned bluish, their bodies went into shock, and many died of cardiac arrest before losing consciousness. When their pulse weakened, they were pulled from the water and revived only to be submerged again, repeating the cycle until they finally died. To test rewarming methods, Rascher ordered female prisoners from nearby camps to be brought to the experiment room. They were forced to embrace the dying men in an attempt to transfer body heat. If the subject did not recover, the process was deemed a failure, and another victim was selected. Some SS doctors believed these experiments were crucial for the survival of German soldiers on the Eastern Front, and the data collected was later used by post-war medical institutions, a dark legacy that is rarely acknowledged. Another key doctor in the extermination machinery was Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal surgeon and director of the Action T4 euthanasia program. Brandt oversaw experimental executions using injections of phenol, gasoline, and air into the bloodstream. The goal was to find the fastest, quietest, and most efficient method of killing without leaving traces. In some tests, prisoners were executed with a gunshot to the head seconds after the injection to compare the effects on their organs during autopsy. In other cases, they were forced to ingest experimental poisons, while Nazi doctors meticulously documented each phase of their agony. This program not only eliminated thousands of people with mental and physical disabilities, but also served as a testing ground for the extermination methods that would later be applied in concentration camps. The experiments were not limited to adult men. At Ravensbrück, a camp where most prisoners were women, inhumane surgical studies were conducted. SS doctors amputated limbs without anesthesia, transplanted muscles and nerves from one body to another, and in some cases deliberately infected wounds with bacteria to study the progression of gangrene. Documents indicate that some prisoners were forced to walk on fractured bones just to analyze the body's resistance before collapsing. On multiple occasions, operations were performed with no hygiene measures whatsoever, leaving victims in unbearable suffering while doctors took notes on how quickly the infection spread. In the same camp, forced sterilization experiments were conducted, injecting corrosive substances into women's reproductive organs to render them infertile. Some victims survived, but were left with chronic pain, constant hemorrhages, and lifelong physical consequences. One of the most atrocious experiments was carried out by Josef Mengele, the so-called Angel of Death of Auschwitz. His presence at the selection ramp was among the most feared, as with a simple movement of his finger, he decided who would be sent directly to the gas chambers and who would be kept for his experiments. Mengele was particularly interested in children, pregnant women, and people with physical or genetic anomalies whom he saw as invaluable scientific material. His laboratory was located in Block 10 of Auschwitz, a section of the camp where his victims were subjected to experiments so inhumane that even some other Nazi doctors considered them excessive. One of his primary interests was the study of bone growth and regeneration. To this end, he subjected his victims to deliberate fractures and observed the healing process without providing any form of treatment. In some cases, he repeatedly broke the same bones at different time intervals to analyze whether the body could regain its original shape after multiple traumas. When his patients could no longer endure the pain, or when his experiments reached a dead end, he killed them and performed dissections to directly examine the internal structure of the damaged bones. This practice not only caused unimaginable suffering, but also reduced his victims to mere objects of observation in his insatiable pursuit of pseudo-scientific knowledge. The doctor was also obsessed with immunity and resistance to contagious diseases. Several groups of prisoners were deliberately infected with deadly bacteria, such as typhoid fever and tuberculosis, to evaluate how their bodies responded without any form of treatment. At times, he extracted blood and bone marrow samples before the disease reached its terminal phase, searching for potential differences in recovery capacity among different ethnic groups. Mengele believed that pure Aryans should possess greater resistance to diseases compared to Jews, Roma, and other populations he considered inferior. When the infection reached its most critical stage, he let the prisoners die in complete isolation, preventing them from receiving any aid from fellow inmates so that his observations would not be altered by external factors. One of the most terrifying procedures he carried out involved the manipulation of internal organs while the victims were still alive. In some experiments, he attempted to remove parts of the liver or lungs without anesthesia, observing how long a person could survive without a crucial part of their body. In other cases, he performed organ transplants between prisoners without considering blood compatibility or proper medical techniques, resulting in immediate rejection and a slow, painful death from infection. Mengele seemed fascinated by the idea of prolonging his victims' lives to their maximum resistance point before they succumbed to their wounds, as if he were exploring the physical limits of the human body under extreme conditions. The sadism of his experiments was not limited to medicine. He also subjected his victims to physical endurance tests designed to evaluate the human body's capacity under extreme circumstances. Prisoners were forced to run to total exhaustion without food or water, while Mengele and his assistants recorded their endurance times before collapsing. Some were tied in forced positions for days, causing muscle atrophy and necrosis in their limbs. In other cases, prisoners were exposed to intense levels of radiation to analyze its long-term effects, with no regard for the suffering it caused. What set Mengele apart from other Nazi doctors was not just the brutality of his methods, but the absolute calm with which he conducted them, as if he were performing simple laboratory tests on animals, without the slightest sign of compassion or remorse. Although he presented himself as a scientist in search of knowledge, his experiments had no real scientific basis. Most of his tests lacked methodological rigor, and his conclusions were more ideological than medical. However, this did not stop him from meticulously documenting each of his actions, storing thousands of detailed records on the procedures and results of his experiments. When the Soviet army approached Auschwitz, Mengele destroyed much of his work before fleeing, but some documents survived, revealing the magnitude of his cruelty. These experiments were not only acts of sadism disguised as science. Declassified post-war archives have found evidence that some execution methods developed in concentration camps were later studied by military and intelligence agencies in subsequent decades. The relationship between these experiments and their application in more recent contexts remains a controversial topic. After the collapse of the Third Reich, some of these doctors faced justice. Karl Brandt was convicted at the Nuremberg trials and executed in 1948. Sigmund Rascher was not so fortunate. After falling out of favor with his superiors, he was arrested by the Gestapo and executed in 1945, not for his crimes, but for internal political reasons. But others escaped. Josef Mengele fled to South America and lived in Brazil until his death in 1979, never captured despite numerous arrest warrants against him. Operation 1005, the Nazi plan to erase the Holocaust. When the defeat of the Third Reich became inevitable, the Nazi priority was no longer to win the war, but to conceal their crimes. It was not just about destroying documents or eliminating witnesses, but something far more sinister, physically erasing all evidence of genocide. Operation 1005 was the final great massacre of the Holocaust, an act of desperation where the only proof of the victims' existence was mountains of ashes scattered to the wind. It was the Nazis' last attempt to deny the undeniable, an effort to rewrite history as the Reich collapsed around them. The plan was conceived in 1942 by Heinrich Himmler, who understood that if the Allies discovered the extermination camps intact, the Reich would be forever marked by a crime too monstrous to deny. Until then, the Nazis had operated under the certainty that their victory was inevitable and that the final solution would be a secret buried along with its victims. However, as they progressively lost territory on the Eastern Front and faced increasing pressure from the Allies in the West, it became evident that defeat was a real possibility. Nazi propaganda had justified the persecution of Jews and other minorities as a necessary measure for racial purity. But there was no way to justify the existence of camps like Treblinka, Sobibor, or Belzec, where death had been industrialized on an unimaginable scale. Himmler, always obsessed with organization and control, realized that the only option was to eliminate all traces of these crimes before they fell into enemy hands. To carry out this task, Himmler turned to one of the officers with the most experience in mass murder, Paul Blobel. A veteran of World War I, Blobel had become a key instrument of the Nazi regime, leading massacres on the Eastern Front as a commander of the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile extermination units that annihilated entire communities in their path. In 1941, he directed the Babi Yar massacre in Ukraine, where more than 33,000 Jews were shot in a single weekend. His brutality and efficiency earned him the trust of his superiors, making him the ideal candidate to lead the final phase of the Holocaust, the eradication of the evidence itself. His mission was as monumental as it was disturbing: to exhume and eliminate the bodies of millions of victims before enemy armies could find them. For a killer like Blobel, who had spent years orchestrating massacres, the idea of erasing his own crimes was not a moral dilemma, but a continuation of the same bureaucratic logic of extermination. However, the challenge was enormous. The mass graves were countless, and in many cases, they contained bodies that had been buried for months or even years, meaning that the process of elimination had to be precisely designed to be completed in the shortest possible time. The orders were clear: the mass graves had to be emptied, the corpses incinerated, and any remains made to disappear. To accomplish this, special units known as Sonderkommando 1005 were formed, composed of prisoners forced to destroy the evidence of extermination. These men, mostly Jews and Soviet prisoners of war, were recruited under the false promise that their lives would be spared as long as they carried out their work. They knew this promise was nothing but a lie. Any Sonderkommando understood that their fate would ultimately be the same as those whose bodies they were forced to handle. Under constant SS surveillance, these prisoners worked in inhumane conditions, surrounded by mountains of decomposing corpses, many of which belonged to their own family members, friends, or barracks mates. They had no choice but to obey orders. Any sign of resistance or exhaustion was punished with immediate execution. The process of body disposal became a sinister routine. First, the prisoners had to open the mass graves and exhume the corpses, many of which were so decomposed that they disintegrated in their hands. At times, the stench was so unbearable that some prisoners vomited uncontrollably, only to be mocked by the Nazi guards. In some cases, the bodies were so tightly packed that the Sonderkommando had to use metal hooks to extract them, a sight reminiscent of handling meat in a slaughterhouse. The bodies were then transported to massive funeral pyres, where they were carefully arranged to ensure efficient combustion. The Nazis discovered that the best way to incinerate large numbers of corpses was to place the fresher bodies at the base of the pyre, as human fat acted as a natural fuel that facilitated the burning of the drier skeletal remains. To optimize this process, railway tracks were used as support, creating structures that resembled the grates used in industrial crematories. Before setting the pyres ablaze, the prisoners had to soak the bodies with gasoline, a task they carried out with a mixture of resignation and horror. They knew they were participating in the destruction of the only tangible evidence of the Holocaust, but they had no choice. When the flames finally consumed the corpses, the stench of burning flesh spread for miles. In some areas, local inhabitants reported seeing columns of dark smoke rising on the horizon, accompanied by a smell they had never experienced before. Although the Nazis tried to conceal these operations, they could not prevent the very air from being impregnated with the evidence of their genocide. The work of the Sonderkommando did not end with the burning of the bodies. After the pyres burned for hours, they had to remove the charred remains and crush the bones until they were reduced to dust. To do this, they used hammers, mallets, and even improvised machines that turned bone fragments into tiny particles. The resulting ash was collected in sacks and scattered in rivers, fields, or even deeper pits, in the hope that time and nature would erase any trace. In some cases, the Nazis mixed the ash with soil and used it to camouflage the original graves, planting trees or shrubs on top to conceal any evidence of the massacre. In their twisted logic, they believed that if there were no bodies left, then the crime could never be proven. The sadism with which the Nazis carried out Operation 1005 was not limited to the disposal of corpses. For their own entertainment, SS guards forced prisoners to perform absurd tasks, such as sorting the remains into categories based on their level of incineration, or identifying victims by the fragments of clothing or hair still attached to their bones. On more than one occasion, Sonderkommando prisoners were forced to play with the skulls of victims as if they were soccer balls, while Nazi officers laughed. These humiliations were part of the total dehumanization that defined the Holocaust. To the Nazis, their victims were not people but waste to be eliminated with the same indifference as wiping a trace of blood from the floor. But despite the meticulous planning of Operation 1005, Erasing the Holocaust proved more difficult than the Nazis had anticipated. It was not just the immense number of bodies that had to be disposed of, but also the impossibility of erasing all testimonies, records, and traces of the crimes. The Allies were getting closer, and the speed of their advance forced the Nazis to abandon many extermination sites before completing their work. In some cases, the crematoriums were still hot when Soviet soldiers arrived at the concentration camps. In other places, the urgency to destroy evidence led the Nazis to leave behind incriminating documents and photographs. Although Operation 1005 managed to eliminate millions of bodies, it could not make the Holocaust disappear. The bone fragments left in the graves, the testimonies of survivors, and the overwhelming amount of evidence found in the liberated camps were more than enough to prove the magnitude of the genocide. The Nazis carried out Operation 1005 in major extermination centers such as Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec, as well as in the execution sites of the Eastern Front. At Babi Yar, the largest massacre perpetrated in the Soviet Union, the bodies of more than 33,000 people were exhumed and burned in just a few months. But the Nazis knew that destroying the bodies was not enough. They also had to eliminate documents, administrative records, and any structures that revealed the scale of the genocide. Gas chambers were dismantled, camp buildings were dynamited, and the land was reforested to make it appear as if no extermination facilities had ever existed. In some cases, local farmers were even brought in to resettle the area and erase any trace of the extermination operations. Despite meticulous planning, the operation was not perfect. By 1944, while the Nazis were still trying to erase their tracks, the Soviet and American armies began liberating the first concentration camps. In some places, the flames of the funeral pyres were still burning when Allied soldiers arrived. At Treblinka, Sobibor, and Chelmno, the ground was still disturbed and full of bone fragments. In certain sites, the crematoriums were still hot. The Sonderkommando 1005 prisoners were systematically executed after completing their work, but some managed to escape and testified about what they had been forced to do. They were the ones who revealed the details of the operation to the world, allowing researchers to reconstruct how the Nazis had tried to make the Holocaust disappear. Their accounts, written in secret diaries and buried near the camps, became key pieces of evidence in the Nuremberg trials. Paul Blobel, the mastermind behind Operation 1005, was captured after the war and brought to trial in Nuremberg. In his testimony, he never showed remorse. He simply stated that he had followed orders. He was sentenced to death and executed in 1951. However, many of his subordinates managed to escape, and others received minor sentences, benefiting from the Cold War and the lack of political will to pursue all those responsible. The Nazis tried to erase history, but they failed. The documents survived. The photographs were recovered. The testimonies of the survivors echoed in post-war courts. And in some camps, decades later, bone fragments can still be found in the soil. They did not manage to eliminate all the evidence. They did not succeed in hiding the genocide. And above all, they did not silence the victims.